Please comment where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you enjoy the content. I inherited the cabin from my grandfather 3 months after his funeral, along with a leather-bound ledger I'd never seen him write in. The property sat 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. Perfect for what I needed. Complete isolation while I figured out what to do with my life after the divorce. The first week passed without incident. I chopped wood, fixed the sagging porch steps, and tried to make sense of Grandpa's ledger. Page after page contained strange symbols, angular marks that looked like a child's attempt at writing, interspersed with what might have been measurements or coordinates. I assumed they were surveying notes from his younger days, when he'd worked for the county. The drawings meant nothing to me then. I'd been religious about the deadbolt since arriving. City habits die hard, and even in the middle of nowhere, I locked up tight each night. So when I woke that first Tuesday to find the heavy steel bolt drawn back, my blood went cold. I knew I'd locked it. I remembered the satisfying chunk of metal sliding home, the way I always tested the handle twice. The door hung slightly ajar, morning mist creeping through the gap like curious fingers. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought from home and checked every room, every closet, under the bed. Nothing. No signs of disturbance, nothing missing. Just that unlocked door and the certainty that something had been inside while I slept. I spent the day reinforcing my defenses. New locks on the windows, a chair wedged under the door handle, and, remembering something from a horror movie, a line of salt across the threshold. I'd found an old horseshoe nailed above the door frame and made sure it was positioned properly, points up to catch good luck. Grandpa had always been superstitious about such things. That night, I barely dozed. Every settling timber, every whisper of wind through the pines had me bolt upright, bat in hand. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin with the patience of a predator. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crept to the window, but whatever was out there moved silently through the underbrush. I caught glimpses, a shadow too tall and too thin moving wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. Then came the tapping, methodical strikes against the cabin walls, moving from window to window. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Like it was testing each potential entry point, learning the structure's weaknesses. Michael. My name drifted through the walls, spoken in a voice that sounded almost human. Almost. Michael, I know you're listening. My hands shook as I gripped the bat tighter. Nobody knew I was here. I'd told no one about the cabin, about my plans to disappear for a while. Yet this thing, whatever it was, knew my name, spoke it with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. Michael. Closer now, right outside the front door. Your grandfather knew the rules. Why don't you? The circling continued for hours. Sometimes the voice would call my name from the east side of the cabin, then immediately whisper it from the west, as if the thing could move faster than sound itself. I huddled in the center of the main room, surrounded by my pathetic defenses, until dawn finally broke. Sunlight revealed the truth of my visitor. Four-toed tracks pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin. Not quite human, not quite animal. They circled the building exactly as I'd heard, but there were too many of them, overlapping in impossible ways, as if my visitor had been multiple beings or the same being moving through time differently than I understood it. Worse were the symbols carved into the dirt near the front steps. Angular marks that made my eyes water to look at directly, scratched deep enough to expose the clay beneath the topsoil. I ran inside for Grandpa's ledger, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There, page 47. The exact same symbols, drawn in my grandfather's careful hand, with a single word written beneath them in his spidery script. Boundary. My salt line lay scattered, as if something had deliberately scuffed it away. The horseshoe above the door hung inverted, points down, spilling whatever luck it might have held. I packed in 20 minutes, throwing clothes and essentials into my car with shaking hands. As I loaded the last bag, I noticed something tucked under my windshield wiper, an envelope from Morrison County Surveying, forwarded from my old address. I didn't open it until I was 50 miles away, parked at a gas station with my hands finally steady enough to tear the paper. The letter was brief, professional, apologetic. A routine property survey had revealed an error in the original land grants from the 1890s. My grandfather's cabin sat on a parcel that had been deeded twice. Once to him, once to something called the Tall Pine Collective, a group that had vanished from county records in 1923. The property existed in a legal gray area, a boundary dispute that had never been resolved. According to the surveyor, the cabin shouldn't exist where it did. It occupied a space that belonged to no one and everyone, a gap in the orderly world of property lines and legal ownership. I took a long weekend because my brain felt like a buzzing phone I couldn't switch off. Ridgeway Loop kept popping up in a forum thread. Moderate, great overlooks, hardly anyone out there. One reply had stuck with me. Blazes move up there. Keep your head on a swivel. Another account, ghosted since last year, mentioned a guy named Tanner Kincaid who never came back. People joked, then the mod locked the comments. That's what sold me, I guess. Quiet plus a story you're not supposed to tell. I rolled in before sunrise, the lot empty, my old Cherokee ticking as it cooled. The air out there didn't feel recycled. Cold cut right through the city dust in my lungs. The first miles were as easy as promised, straight, cathedral-tall trunks, a soft underfoot crumble that let me hear my own steps without drowning me in them. I pitched near a glass-clear creek, boiled noodles on a pocket stove, and went quiet in a way I forgot existed. That night I watched a small fire burn down until stars found the gaps in the canopy. I slept like a door closing. Morning bit, bright enough to sting the eyes. I took a day pack, water, bars, compass, the cheap map folded to show the ridge spurs, and went hunt the overlook everyone bragged about. The climb steepened in a hurry, but it was the good hurt. A burn you earn. The blazes thinned, then vanished. I backtracked 10 paces, scanning trunks for that stamp of orange. Nothing. The path still looked stamped in and honest, so I trusted my boots and kept moving. The first wrong thing was the rope. It hung from a low oak like a tired noose, frayed and blackened. The branch above it was burned in a perfect ring, like someone had cored the limb with a hot iron. No other scorch on the tree. I stood there way too long, mouth tasting like pennies, trying to make it a prank. I took out my phone for a photo and hesitated, felt stupid, but I didn't want the image living in my pocket. I kept moving. Bones came next, chalk pale against wet leaves. Not a whole skeleton, just a scatter. A rib. A long tapering piece that wanted to be a femur but looked stretched. Deer, my head offered automatic, like naming it made it obey a rule. My gut didn't buy it. That's when the forest changed. It didn't grow quieter, it shut off. 1 second there were woodpecks and wind. The next, my breathing was the loudest thing in the world. I turned around, and the trail I'd trusted felt like it shrugged. Trees crowded closer, slopes skewed sharper, landmarks unhooked themselves. I couldn't see the rope, or the bones, or the bright creak of obvious choices. I told myself a rule out loud just to hear a voice. Downhill finds water, water finds roads. I flipped open the compass from my grandfather's tackle box and set a bearing toward the creek I'd camped on. Then I made a decision that felt like it mattered. I took the knife, the map, the compass, and 2 waters out of the day pack and ditched the rest. If I was wrong, I'd pay for it. If I was right, I didn't need a bag slowing me when the slope turned mean. I took 1 step and heard it breathe. Not a deer's nervous huff or a bear's wet rumble. This was long, syrup-thick inhaling through a throat that didn't know how to do it right. Then the exhale scratched out of something raw. I went still. The breath came again, closer, threaded through with a mumble like a person trying on language. The words slipped and broke apart, as if whatever was making them had watched us from a distance, then tried to sound human without understanding the joints. Then wood groaned, something heavy leaning into bark. I didn't wait for more. I ran. Branches scored my arms. My shins took 3 hits in a row that would bloom the next day into galaxy bruises I didn't remember getting. My compass needle jittered and then settled. I kept it in the corner of my eye like a poem I'd been assigned to memorize. My lungs clawed for air. The silence ran with me. Blue flashed through trunks, my tarp. I stumbled into camp like I'd burst from a tunnel. The fire ring still held a smudge of ash. I didn't bother with the tent. I snatched the compass cord from around my neck, cinched my belt tighter, and went for the downhill run like gravity owed me a favor. I made the mistake of looking back. It stood between 2 birches up the ridge, tall enough to brush the first branch if it wanted. Arms hung wrong long, past the knees, fingers like wet twigs. Its skin wasn't pale or dark, it was the color of bark after rain, slick and almost pulsing when it moved a fraction. The head tilted to a dog's question angle, then further, too far, like the neck didn't have stops. Its mouth opened. No roar. It pulled my name out of itself, slow and threadbare, and drew it until the syllable scraped. Jace. Nobody on the loop had said my name. I hadn't spoken it since I left town. I ran until the trees cracked open into gravel. A road. I spat blood. I'd bitten my tongue somewhere in the blur, and limped the line until a square green box hove up out of the woods like a ship. The ranger station. I went in with my chest hitching and hands empty. The woman at the desk wore a stitched tag, Rivas, and the frown of someone deciding if you're trouble. I tried something neutral. Got turned around. My voice sounded like I'd borrowed it. She had me sit, put water in my hand, and took my name and route. When she came back from the back room, she said, "Mr. Harlan, you went 7 miles off any marked trail." She tapped a laminated map. "We don't have blazes up there." I followed them. I said before I could stop myself. "Orange." Forum said they move. Her face didn't change. That was the first scare. I told her about the rope because it felt like a safer confession than the voice that knew me. She didn't take notes on that part. She just stared at my face like it might tell her if I was lying to myself. "Burned ring on a limb," I said. Rope looked old. Rivas's eyes flicked, involuntary, toward a corkboard with old Polaroids stapled to it. She caught herself and looked back at me. "Lightning takes odd bites out here," she said too quickly. "You see, Bear?" "No." She exhaled like she was making a decision she didn't want to own. "We cut a rope off an oak up there in 2008, she said. "Camp kids. Stupid thing. We hauled it out and burned the rest of the branch. There isn't a rope there anymore." I didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say that didn't sound like I'd stayed too long at the fire and dreamed bad. She stood, already done with me. "We'll radio if we find your gear," she said. "Stick to marked loops, Mr. Harlan. And don't answer if something in the trees calls your name." It was the way she said if that reached cold fingers down my back. I drove until the ridges flattened into farmland and the mountains became a smudge in the rear view, and still my ears felt packed with that heavy, turned-off quiet. That night, I opened the forum out of spite. The Ridgeway thread was locked. A new, short post had been pinned above it by the mod. No comment allowed. It read, "Do not call names in the woods." I closed the app, locked my apartment door, shoved the deadbolt twice, then checked it again. I slept with the compass on the nightstand, like it could point me away from whatever had learned how to say me. The boot prints appeared at mile marker 47.3, just past where the Appalachian Trail splits from the old logging road near Seneca Rocks. I'd been hiking solo for 3 days through West Virginia's most remote backcountry, following a section I'd mapped meticulously using both current USGS topographics and historical Civilian Conservation Corps records from the 1940s. The prints were fresh, maybe 6 hours old based on the crisp edges and lack of debris, but they were all wrong. Each impression measured roughly 14 inches long and 6 wide, far larger than any human foot. The heel strike was too deep, the toe spread too broad, and the gait pattern stretched nearly 4 feet between steps. What unsettled me most wasn't their size, but their freshness. The morning dew had evaporated from the surrounding trail, yet these prints held moisture in their deepest recesses, as if they'd been made after sunrise despite the complete absence of any other human sign for miles. I photographed each print with my phone, using my hiking boot for scale. The tread pattern was unlike anything I'd seen. Not the waffle sole of a hiking boot or the aggressive lugs of a mountaineering shoe, but something organic, almost like bark texture pressed into the mud. I checked my GPS. 38 degrees 50 minutes 12 seconds north, 79 degrees 22 minutes 45 seconds west, elevation 3,247 feet. According to my maps, I was still 8 miles from the nearest road access. The prints followed the trail for exactly 0.7 miles before vanishing at a granite outcropping. Not fading gradually or becoming harder to track. They simply ended, as if whatever made them had stepped onto the rock and dissolved into air. I spent 20 minutes searching the surrounding area, checking every possible route of departure. Nothing. The forest floor beyond the outcropping showed no disturbance, no broken twigs, no compressed leaves. By late afternoon, I reached Shelter 23B according to my CC Sierra documentation, though my modern trail guide made no mention of it. The structure sat in a small clearing at 3,890 feet elevation, a 3-sided log lean-to with a stone fire ring, and a weathered wooden sign reading, "Built 1941, CCC Camp 3. The shelter appeared on my 1943 topographic map, but was absent from anything printed after 1950. I'd specifically sought it out as part of my research into abandoned trail infrastructure. The shelter was in remarkable condition for something supposedly forgotten for 70 years. The logs showed minimal rot, the roof remained intact, and someone had recently cleared the fire ring of debris. A metal tag on the front post read S23B, confirming my location. I set up my sleeping bag inside and prepared dinner as shadows lengthened through the hardwood canopy. The clicking started at 11:47 p.m. At first, I mistook it for settling wood or cooling metal, but the sound had a deliberate rhythm. 3 short clicks, pause, 2 long clicks, pause, repeat. It seemed to originate from the tree line about 50 yards north of the shelter. I grabbed my headlamp and swept the beam across the forest. The clicking stopped immediately. I waited, listening to my heartbeat and the normal night sounds of the mountains. After 5 minutes, I clicked my headlamp off and on 3 times in quick succession. The response was immediate. 3 clicks from the darkness, perfectly mimicking my pattern. My skin crawled. I tried a different sequence, 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. The response came back exactly the same, but from a different location, maybe 30 yards to the east. Something was moving through the forest, staying just beyond my light's reach, and it was learning. I clicked my headlamp in a rapid staccato, 7 quick flashes. The forest erupted. Dozens of clicking sounds burst from every direction, a cacophony of responses that seemed to come from the canopy, the ground, behind trees, above my head. The sounds overlapped and echoed, creating a disorienting symphony that made it impossible to determine how many sources were out there or how close they'd gotten. I grabbed my pack and fled. The nearest water source was Laurel Creek, about half a mile downhill to the southeast. I'd studied the topography carefully and knew the stream eventually connected to a Forest Service road. More importantly, I remembered my grandfather's advice from childhood camping trips. If something's tracking you in the woods, get in the water. Most things won't follow. I crashed through the underbrush, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as branches tore at my jacket. The clicking sounds pursued me, always just at the edge of hearing, maintaining their call and response pattern even as I ran. When I reached the creek, I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the knee-deep water and began wading downstream, letting the current help carry me away from whatever circled the shelter. I followed Laurel Creek for 3 miles in the darkness, my boots squelching with each step, until I reached the Forest Service road. From there, I hiked another 2 miles to my truck, arriving just as dawn broke over the ridgeline. 3 days later, I contacted the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources to report the incident. Ranger Patricia Hendricks was professional, but puzzled when I described the location. "Sir, there's no shelter at those coordinates," she said, checking her database. "The nearest backcountry shelter is Seneca Rocks, about 12 miles south of where you're describing." I insisted, providing GPS coordinates, photographs of the boot prints, and detailed descriptions of the structure. Hendricks agreed to investigate and called me back that afternoon. "We found your food bag," she said. "It was hanging from a tree exactly where you said you left it. But sir, there's no shelter there. Never has been, according to our records. Just an old stone fire ring, probably from the CCC days, but no structure." I checked my phone for the photos I'd taken of the shelter. The images were there, the 3-sided lean-to, the wooden sign, the metal tag. But when I zoomed in on the tag, my blood chilled. Instead of S23B, it clearly read S47K. I pulled out my 1943 topographic map with shaking hands. Shelter S47K had been located 14 miles north of where I'd spent the night, and according to the CCC records, it had burned down in 1947 after a lightning strike. The boot prints in my photos were still there, still impossible, still ending at that granite outcropping. But now I noticed something I'd missed before. In the background of one image, barely visible among the trees, was a tall, dark shape that definitely hadn't been there when I took the picture. The trail to Devil's Backbone had been calling to me for 3 months, ever since Sarah's funeral. Not because she'd loved hiking, she'd hated the cold, preferred her nature filtered through coffee shop windows, but because I needed somewhere that would punish me properly. Somewhere that matched the weight I'd been carrying since the accident. The February morning bit through my layers as I shouldered my pack. 6 miles up, 6 miles back. 12 miles to think about how I should have taken her keys that night, how I should have called her an Uber, how I should have done 1,000 things differently. The parking lot held only my truck, its engine ticking as it cooled in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd started before sunrise on purpose. Wanted the mountain to myself, wanted the kind of solitude that would let me scream if I needed to. The headlamp beam carved a narrow tunnel through the pines as I began the ascent, my breath forming clouds that dissipated into the black air above. For the first hour, the forest kept me company. Wind sighed through the branches overhead. My boots crunched through the crusted snow. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker worked at dead bark with mechanical precision. Asterisk tap tap tap, tap 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 asterisk. The sound echoing off the frozen trees like a metronome keeping time with my guilt. The trail switchbacked up the mountainside, each turn revealing more of the same. Snow-heavy pines, granite outcroppings, the occasional deer track crossing my path. I fell into the rhythm of it, the burn in my calves, the steady rasp of my breathing. This was what I'd come for, the physical exhaustion that might finally quiet the voice in my head that kept replaying that phone call from the hospital. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sun had crested the eastern peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. I stopped to drink water and check my phone, no signal as expected. Just me and the mountain, and the weight of what I'd done. That's when I noticed the woodpecker had changed its rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Slower now. Deliberate. Almost thoughtful. I looked up through the canopy, trying to spot the bird, but saw only branches and sky. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, off the main trail. Tap, tap, tap. I shook my head and kept climbing. Grief did strange things to perception. I'd learned that over the past 3 months. Made you hear voices in the wind, see faces in shadows. Made you think a woodpecker's rhythm meant something more than hunger and instinct. The trail grew steeper as I approached the final mile to Devil's Backbone Overlook. Here, the trees thinned and the path hugged the mountainside, with a sheer drop to my right that disappeared into morning mist. Ice glazed the rocks, making each step a negotiation between forward progress and staying alive. That's when the forest went silent. Not gradually, all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The wind stopped. The distant bird calls ceased. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. I paused, listening to the sudden absence of sound, feeling my pulse quicken for reasons I couldn't name. In the silence, I heard it again, tap, tap, tap. But now it was coming from behind me. I turned, scanning the trail I'd just climbed, but saw nothing except my own tracks in the snow. The sound stopped. I waited, counting heartbeats, then continued toward the overlook. 50 yards later, I found the hare. It was caught on a low branch at eye level, impossible to miss, a clump of coarse, dark strands that looked almost like horsehair, but wrong somehow. Too thick. Too oily. When I touched it, it felt rough against my fingers, and underneath the winter smell of pine and snow I caught something else. Something rank and wild that made my stomach turn. I should have turned back then. Should have listened to the primitive part of my brain that was already screaming warnings. Instead, I pressed on, telling myself it was just deer hair, or maybe from a bear that had brushed against the tree during its autumn wanderings. The bone was harder to explain away. I found it 20 yards further up the trail, lying in the center of the path like it had been placed there deliberately. At first glance, it looked human, the right size and shape for a femur, but when I knelt to examine it more closely, the proportions were all wrong. Too long in some places, too thick in others. The surface had been polished smooth, as if by years of handling, and it gleamed dully in the morning light. My hands shook as I photographed it with my phone, though I knew the pictures would be useless without signal. The bone felt significant somehow, like evidence of something I didn't want to understand. I left it where I'd found it and hurried toward the overlook, suddenly desperate to reach my destination and begin the journey back down. The prints stopped me cold. They were pressed deep into a patch of soft snow just before the final turn to Devil's Backbone, and they were unmistakably human in shape. 5 toes, an arch, a heel. But they were bare feet in February snow, and the toes ended in what looked like claws. Deep gouges in the earth showed where those claws had dug in for purchase on the icy ground. The prints were fresh. Steam still rose from the deepest impressions. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was closer now, coming from the trees just ahead. I fumbled for my phone, knowing it was useless but needing something familiar in my hands. The screen showed no signal, but in its black reflection, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw only empty trail and swaying branches. When I looked back at my phone, there were 3 long scratches across the screen that hadn't been there moments before. That's when I ran. I abandoned all pretense of careful hiking and bolted for the overlook, slipping on ice, catching myself on rocks, driven by a terror I couldn't name. Behind me, I heard something large crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. The overlook opened before me, a granite platform jetting out over the valley, with a 1,000-foot drop to the forest below. I'd reached my destination, but there was nowhere left to go. The trail ended here, at the edge of the world. I turned to face whatever was following me. It emerged from the tree line in a series of movements that hurt to watch, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy, limbs extending and contracting like a spider's legs. The thing that had once been human, or had learned to mimic humanity, moved with predatory grace across the snow-covered rock. Its face was the worst part, almost familiar, almost right, but stretched and wrong in ways that made my vision blur. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was that same deliberate tapping, asterisk tap, tap, tap asterisk, but now I could see it was made by a tongue striking teeth that were too sharp and too many. I backed toward the edge of the overlook, ice cracking under my boots. The drop yawned behind me, but the thing in front of me was worse than falling. It approached with patient hunger, joints snapping and popping with each impossible movement. My heel found empty air. For a moment, I teetered on the brink, arms windmilling, death reaching up from the valley below. Then muscle memory kicked in, years of rock climbing, of understanding balance and momentum. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the icy granite, scrambling for the trail that led back down the mountain. The thing shrieked behind me, a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal. I didn't look back. I ran down that trail faster than I'd ever moved in my life, leaping over rocks, sliding down icy sections on my back, driven by pure animal terror. I reached my truck as the sun was setting, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I reversed out of the parking space with a spray of gravel and snow. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I noticed the hair caught on my door handle. The same coarse, oily strands I'd found on the mountain, twisted around the metal like a calling card. I still have nightmares about that sound. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes I hear it in the walls of my house, patient and deliberate, counting down to something I don't want to understand. Sarah's death had brought me to that mountain seeking punishment for my guilt. Instead, I'd found something that made guilt seem like a luxury. The knowledge that some hungers are older than human sorrow, and some things in the wilderness are better left undisturbed. The hair is still on my door handle. I haven't had the courage to remove it. The generator had been off for 3 days when I arrived at Uncle Ray's cabin, and he made it clear it was staying that way. "Don't touch it," he said, not looking up from the firewood he was splitting. His axe came down with mechanical precision, splitting each log clean through. Battery lanterns work fine. Propane stove cooks just the same. I set my duffel bag on the porch and watched him work. Ray had always been a man of few words, but there was something different about his clipped tone now, something that made my stomach tighten. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. I'd come here as a kid, remembered the hum of the generator at night, the warm yellow glow of electric lights cutting through the wilderness dark. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. Ray's axe paused mid-swing. "Nothing's wrong with it." He brought the blade down harder than necessary. "Just don't need it running all the time. Waste of fuel." That first night, I understood why he preferred the quiet. The silence was absolute in a way city dwellers never experience. No traffic, no neighbors, no electrical hum. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of settling wood. I sat by the propane lantern reading, occasionally glancing at the windows that reflected nothing but my own face against the black glass. It was past midnight when I heard the first scraping. The sound came from the north wall, a slow drag like fingernails on bark. I set down my book and listened, but it had stopped. Probably a branch rubbing against the cabin in the wind, though I couldn't recall feeling any breeze. I went back to reading, but the words swam on the page. My gut was telling me something was wrong, the same instinct that had kept me alive through 2 tours overseas. The scraping came again, longer this time, moving along the wall toward the front of the cabin. I stood and moved to the window, cupping my hands against the glass to peer out. Nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of trees. Then I heard the breathing. It was wet, labored, like something with fluid in its lungs trying to draw air. The sound moved around the cabin's perimeter, and I found myself following it from window to window, never quite catching sight of whatever was making it. The breathing would pause at each window, and I swear I could feel something studying the glass, testing it. I should have trusted my instincts then. Should have grabbed my keys and driven back to town, darkness be damned. Instead, I told myself it was just an animal, a bear maybe, or a sick deer. I'd grown soft in the years since leaving the service, let civilization dull the edge that had once kept me sharp. The sounds continued until dawn, always just out of sight, always moving. I dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake each time the scraping resumed. When morning light finally crept through the windows, the forest looked innocent again, just trees and shadows and the normal sounds of birds beginning their day. I made coffee on the propane stove and stepped onto the porch, telling myself I'd imagine the whole thing. That's when I saw the tracks. They circled the entire cabin, pressed deep into the soft earth. But these weren't bear tracks or deer hooves. They were splits, deep gouges in the ground like something with cloven feet had walked upright around the building. The tracks were massive, easily twice the size of my boot, and they pressed down with enough force to crack the underlying stone in places. The strangest part was how they ended. At the edge of the clearing, the tracks simply stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. No gradual fade, no change in depth, just there one moment, gone the next. I was photographing the tracks with my phone when I noticed the old Polaroid tucked under a loose board on the porch. The photo was faded and water-stained, showing a man I didn't recognize standing beside a truck. He was smiling, holding up a string of fish, but my attention was drawn to the ground behind him. There, clearly visible in the dirt, were the same split tracks I'd just been documenting. Someone had written on the back in Ray's careful handwriting, "Jim Morrison, August 1987. Last guest." My hands were shaking as I looked up at the cabin's front door. Above the frame, nearly hidden by shadow, was something I'd missed the night before, a small iron cross nailed directly into the wood. It was old, hand-forged, and positioned with the deliberate care of someone who believed it might actually protect what lay beyond. I packed my bag in under 10 minutes, my military training taking over. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. Ray was nowhere to be seen, but I left the Polaroid on the kitchen table where he'd find it. Some conversations were better left unspoken. The dirt road back to the highway seemed longer than I remembered, full of curves and shadows that hadn't been there on the drive in. I kept checking my mirrors, though I couldn't say what I expected to see. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I allowed myself to look back. At the treeline, just visible through the gap in the trees, something stood watching. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a shape that hurt to look at directly. But it was the jaw that made me floor the accelerator, a jaw that hung open far too wide, revealing darkness that seemed to go on forever. I drove straight through to the city, didn't stop until I was surrounded by traffic and noise and the comfortable chaos of civilization. But sometimes, late at night when the power goes out and the silence grows too deep, I remember that wet breathing against the walls and wonder if Ray is still keeping the generator off, still nailing iron crosses above his door, still warning visitors who no longer come. Some warnings, I've learned, are worth heeding. The GPS said 23 minutes to get home, but the back roads were flooded again. I'd been driving these hills for 15 years, knew every deer path and logging trail. The muddy shortcut through Millfield Woods would cut that time in half. My headlights swept across the tree line as I turned onto the narrow track. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but water still dripped from the branches overhead, pattering against my windshield like nervous fingers. The truck's tires found purchase in the ruts left by other vehicles, hunters probably, or kids looking for a place to drink beer and pretend they were tough. That's when I saw the tree. It lay across the path about 50 yards ahead, a massive oak that must have been standing when my grandfather was born. But this wasn't storm damage. The bark had been stripped away in long, deliberate spirals, leaving pale wood that gleamed wet in my headlights. The exposed trunk looked like something had been working at it methodically, patiently. I stopped the truck and left it running, stepping out into the mud. The smell hit me immediately, copper sweet, like pennies left in your mouth too long. It made my teeth ache. The roots were the worst part. They'd been chewed. Not cut, not broken, chewed. Something had gnawed through root systems thick as my arm, leaving behind marks that looked almost like bite patterns. But the spacing was all wrong, too wide, and the gouges went too deep. I pulled out my phone to call the county road department, but there was no signal. There never was, this deep in the woods. The dashcam in my truck was still recording, its little red light blinking steadily. At least I'd have proof of why I was late getting home. The tree was too big to move, but there was just enough space to squeeze the truck around it if I went slow and didn't mind scraping some paint. I'd done worse to get through these woods before. I climbed back into the cab, put it in drive, and eased forward. The passenger side mirror folded back as it caught a branch, and I heard the familiar screech of metal against bark. Nothing I couldn't live with. That's when something scraped against the undercarriage. It wasn't the sound of rock or root. I knew those sounds. This was deliberate, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper, longer. The truck shuddered, and I felt whatever it was drag along the entire length of the chassis. I gunned it. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the mud, and I made it maybe 10 feet before something slammed into the tailgate. The whole vehicle rocked forward, and I heard metal buckle. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, something pale and too tall, there and gone in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. The next morning, I took the truck to Kowalski's garage. Eddie had been working on cars since before I was born, had hands that could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it idle. If anyone could tell me what had happened, it was him. He spent 20 minutes under the truck with a flashlight, making the kind of thoughtful humming sounds that usually preceded expensive news. When he finally rolled out from underneath, his face was troubled. "Well?" I asked. "I've seen bears get under vehicles before," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Seen what happens when someone hits a deer at 60 miles an hour. Hell, I've even seen what a mountain lion can do to a car door." He walked around to the tailgate, running his fingers along the damage. The metal was buckled inward, but that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the grooves. 5 parallel lines that curved around the edge of the tailgate like hooked claws had tried to peel it open. "But no animal did this," Eddie said finally. "The force required to bend metal like this, and these marks here." He pointed to the grooves. "They're too precise, too deliberate. It's like something was trying to get inside." I thought about the copper-sweet smell, about the chewed roots and stripped bark. "What do you think it was?" Eddie shrugged, but I could see he was unsettled. "Could be vandalism. Kids with crowbars, maybe. But the pattern's all wrong for that." He paused. "You might want to check your dashcam footage. Sometimes those things pick up details you miss in the moment." I'd forgotten about the dashcam. That evening, I plugged the memory card into my laptop. Most of the footage was exactly what I expected. My headlights sweeping across the muddy track, the fallen tree, my careful navigation around it. But at the moment when something scraped the undercarriage, the video glitched. The image froze for maybe 3 seconds, showing the woods outside my passenger window. At first, I thought it was just a technical malfunction. Then I looked closer. There, barely visible between 2 trees, was a hand. It was pressed against the bark of a birch tree, fingers splayed wide. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. It looked like someone had taken a human hand and stretched it, pulled it like taffy until it was something else entirely. The copper-sweet smell seemed to fill my nostrils again, even though I was sitting in my living room with all the windows closed. I sold the truck the next week. Took a loss on it, but I didn't care. The new owner was a kid from town who wanted something to haul his hunting gear. I didn't mention the damage to the tailgate, and he didn't ask. Some things are better left unexplained. I've been working the lines for 17 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Dead cats wrapped around transformers, bullet holes through insulators, even a mannequin someone had somehow gotten 40 feet up a pole as a prank. But pole 117 was different. Pole 117 was wrong in ways that still make my hands shake when I write this down. It was a Tuesday in October, one of those gray mornings where the fog hangs low and makes everything look like it's underwater. I was running my usual inspection route through Sector 7, the industrial stretch that runs behind the old Hartwell chemical plant. Nothing glamorous, just checking connections, looking for corrosion, making sure some tweaker hadn't tried to strip copper again. Standard procedure: clipboard, digital camera, voltage detector, and my grandfather's lucky multimeter that's older than I am but still reads true. The work order said pole 117 had been flagged for irregular readings by the overnight crew. Probably just a loose neutral or a bad ground, but company policy is company policy. I pulled up to the chain link gate at 7:23 a.m. I remember because I always log my arrival times. The padlock was standard issue, same master lock we use on every gate in the district. Nothing unusual there. But as soon as I stepped out of the truck, I smelled it. Copper pennies and something else, something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. I've smelled electrical fires, burned insulation, even ozone from high-voltage arcs, but this was different. This was organic. Pole 117 stood about 30 yards from the gate, a standard 45-foot class one-seater pole carrying 3 phases of 12.47 kV distribution line. The hardware looked normal from a distance: crossarms, insulators, guy wires, all where they should be. But at the base of the pole, where there should have been ordinary dirt and maybe some weeds, there was a perfect circle of black earth. Not burned black, not oil-stained black, but black like the inside of a cave. Black like the space between stars. The circle was maybe 8 feet across, and the soil within it looked wet despite the fact that we hadn't had rain in 2 weeks. As I got closer, that copper-sweet stench got stronger, and I noticed my EMF detector, a little Radio Shack special I keep clipped to my belt, was clicking like crazy. The needle was dancing between readings, never settling, like it couldn't make sense of what it was detecting. I should have called it in right then. Should have backed away and radioed dispatch. But 17 years of routine makes you stupid, makes you think you can handle whatever's in front of you. So I pulled on my rubber gloves, picked up my voltage detector, and approached the pole. That's when I saw the skin. It was draped around the base of the pole like a discarded bedsheet, pale as parchment and thin enough that I could see the dark earth through it. But it wasn't fabric, it had pores and what looked like fine hair, and when the wind caught it, it moved wrong. Too fluid. Too alive. I was backing away when the thing underneath started to move. The skin began to gather itself, pulling inward like someone was drawing it tight from below. The black earth started to bubble and shift, and something was pushing up from underneath. I heard a sound like wet leather tearing, and then a hand, if you could call it that, broke through the surface. The fingers were too long, jointed in too many places, and they ended in what looked like copper wire instead of nails. Then came the arm, pale and ropey with muscle, and then the head. I've tried to forget that head, but it comes back to me in dreams. It was human-shaped but wrong, like someone had taken a person and stretched them on a rack. The eyes were black holes that seemed to go on forever, and the mouth, Christ, the mouth. The jaw was split down the middle, hanging open in 2 separate pieces that moved independently, like a snake unhinging to swallow prey. The thing pulled itself up out of that black circle with movements that were too smooth, too coordinated. It stood maybe 7 feet tall, all pale skin and impossible angles, and when it looked at me with those void black eyes, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. I ran. Not walked quickly, not retreated professionally. I ran like a scared kid, dropping my clipboard and nearly tripping over my own feet. Behind me, I heard a sound like wet meat slapping against concrete, and when I risked a glance back, the thing was following me on all fours, moving with a horrible spider-like grace that covered ground faster than anything that size should move. I made it to the truck and gunned the engine, gravel spraying as I tore out of there. In my rearview mirror, I saw the thing rise up on its hind legs again, standing there in the middle of the access road, watching me go. Even at that distance, I could feel those black eyes boring into me. I didn't stop shaking until I was back at the yard. I filed my report as equipment malfunction, recommend follow-up inspection. Didn't mention the thing, didn't mention the black circle, didn't mention the smell that still seemed to cling to my clothes. Who would believe it? And more importantly, who would want to? But I did make some quiet changes to my schedule. Swapped shifts with Martinez for the next month, made sure I wouldn't be assigned to Sector 7 again anytime soon. Let someone else deal with Pole 117. 3 weeks later, I was cleaning out my glove box when I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked between my safety manual and a stack of work orders was a red tag I'd never seen before. Standard company issue, but the text was wrong. Do not energize, Pole 117. Biological hazard detected. Authorization level, redacted. Contact, redacted. I never put that tag in my truck. I've never seen a biological hazard designation on any electrical equipment. And those redacted sections, they were blacked out with what looked like permanent marker, done by hand. I burned the tag that night and never spoke of it again. The service road stretched ahead like a scar through the pines, gravel crunching under my truck's tires in the dying light. 23 years I'd been driving this route home from the ranger station, and it never got less lonely. The radio crackled with static. Dispatch had signed off an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through Douglas firs. I'd stayed late again, updating incident reports and filing the stack of missing person flyers that seemed to grow thicker each month. The latest one sat on my passenger seat, Sarah Chun, 26, last seen on the Cascade Trail 3 days ago. What caught my eye wasn't her photo, though her smile reminded me of my daughter, but the crude symbols carved into the tree behind her in the hiking selfie. 3 interlocking circles with lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun, but wrong somehow. Deliberate. I'd seen those same marks on other missing person reports, always in the background, always dismissed as coincidence or teenage vandalism. The radio hissed, a rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like asterisk tick, tick, tick asterisk. I reached over and adjusted the frequency, but the static persisted, keeping time like a metronome. Must be interference from the cell tower they'd installed last spring. I'd complained about it before, how it messed with our communications, but nobody listened to an old ranger's grumbling about technology. The headlights swept across familiar landmarks, the lightning-split oak, the rusted gate to the abandoned logging camp, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear. 5 more miles to my cabin, then a cold beer and whatever game was on ESPN. Simple pleasures for a simple man, my ex-wife used to say, though she hadn't meant it kindly. That's when I saw it. Something stretched across the road ahead, maybe 50 yards out. At first glance, it looked like a fallen tree. We'd had storms last week, and widowmakers were always coming down. I eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield. The shape was too uniform, too deliberate, too long. Asterisk tick, tick, tick asterisk. The radio static matched my heartbeat now, or maybe my heartbeat had synced to it. I couldn't tell which. My foot found the brake, bringing the truck to a crawl. The headlights illuminated what I'd initially mistaken for bark and branches. It was pale, segmented, and it was moving. Not the random twitching of something dying, but a purposeful undulation, like a snake testing the air. The thing, I couldn't think of it as anything else, stretched from one side of the road to the other, easily 20 feet long. Its surface caught the light wrong, reflecting it back in patches that hurt to look at directly. I stopped the truck completely, engine idling. My hand moved instinctively to the radio, but what would I say? Dispatch, this is Ranger Morrison. I've got a situation on Service Road 7. They'd think I'd been drinking again, like after the divorce. The thing began to rise. It didn't unfold or roll over like I expected. Instead, it lifted itself in sections, each segment clicking into place with a sound like breaking kindling. The radio static matched the rhythm perfectly now. Asterisk tick, tick, tick asterisk, as if the two sounds were connected, part of the same impossible mechanism. First, what I'd thought was the head rose from the asphalt, revealing itself to be something else entirely. A cluster of pale protrusions, each one moving independently, testing the air. Then the middle section, lifting with joints that bent in directions that made my eyes water. Finally, the rear portion, which wasn't a tail at all but another cluster of those searching appendages. When it reached its full height, the thing towered over my truck. 12 feet, maybe 15. In the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way its surface rippled like water, the dark spots that might have been eyes or mouths or something worse, the way it held itself perfectly still despite the wind that set the trees swaying around us. It was looking at me. I knew this with the same certainty I knew my own name. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, it was aware of me in a way that made my skin crawl. The missing person flyer crinkled as my hand tightened on the steering wheel. Sarah Chun, last seen on the Cascade Trail. Those symbols carved in the tree behind her. 3 interlocking circles with radiating lines. I'd seen them before, hadn't I? Not just on the flyers, but somewhere else. Somewhere recent. My cabin. The old oak tree beside my driveway. The one I'd been meaning to cut down for years. Last week, after the storms, I'd noticed fresh marks in the bark. Dismissed them as damage from falling branches, but now backslash. The thing took a step toward my truck. Not a step that implied legs, feet, normal locomotion. This was more like a controlled collapse and reformation, the creature flowing from one position to another with that same deliberate clicking. The sound echoed off the trees, multiplied and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I floored it. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on loose gravel before finding purchase. I aimed straight for the thing, some primal part of my brain screaming that I had to get through, had to get home, had to. It moved aside. Not quickly, not with any apparent concern for the 2 tons of metal bearing down on it. The creature simply flowed to the left, clearing the road with an almost casual grace. I caught a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision as I roared past, that pale, segmented surface, those searching appendages, and something that might have been a face turning to track my passage. In my rearview mirror, I watched it settle back into the center of the road. It didn't follow, didn't give chase or make any threatening gestures. It simply stood there, perfectly motionless, watching my taillights fade into the distance. Even when I rounded the bend and lost sight of it, I could feel its attention like a weight between my shoulder blades. The radio static cut out abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the truck's laboring engine. I didn't slow down until I saw the familiar outline of my cabin against the star-scattered sky. Home. Safe. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The silence felt oppressive after the constant noise of the road, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant call of an owl. I grabbed the missing person flyer and my gear, then stepped out into the cool mountain air. The smell of pine and wood smoke should have been comforting, but something felt wrong. Different. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked toward the front door, and that's when I noticed them. Fresh furrows in the driveway, parallel lines carved deep into the packed earth. They ran from the road to my front steps, as if something large had been dragged, or had dragged itself, right up to my door. The marks were still damp. I looked up at the old oak tree beside the house, and in the moonlight, I could clearly see the symbols carved into its bark. 3 interlocking circles with radiating lines, cut deep and recent. The same marks from Sarah Chen's photo. The same marks from all the missing person reports. The same marks that were now carved into my front door. Inside the cabin, my phone was ringing. The headlights cut through the falling snow like knives through gauze, and I could feel my old man's tension radiating from the driver's seat like heat from a busted radiator. We'd made this run to the cabin every December for the past 8 years, checking the generator, making sure the pipes hadn't burst, restocking the emergency supplies. Dad called it keeping the place honest, but I knew it was really about keeping the ghosts at bay. The cabin had been in our family for 3 generations, and it held more than just memories. "Storm's getting worse," I said, watching the windshield wipers struggle against the thickening snow. The truck's heater wheezed like an old dog, barely keeping the frost from creeping up the glass. Dad grunted, his scarred hands gripping the wheel. That scar, a jagged line that ran from his left wrist to his elbow, was something he'd never explained. Mom used to say it was from a hunting accident when he was young, but the way his jaw would tighten whenever anyone mentioned it told a different story. Tonight, in the dashboard's green glow, that scar looked almost black. The cabin sat another mile up the mountain road, tucked into a grove of pines that had stood since before the logging companies came through. We'd been making good time despite the weather, but now the snow was coming down so hard I could barely make out the tree line. The truck's engine growled as Dad downshifted for the final climb. That's when something glided across our headlights. It was there and gone in less than a second, a shadow with substance, moving too smoothly to be falling debris, too large to be a bird. The shape had an organic flow to it, like watching silk underwater, but there was something fundamentally wrong about the way it moved. No wings, no visible means of propulsion, just this fluid, purposeful glide from one side of the road to the other. Jesus Christ. I breathed, my hand instinctively going to the glove compartment where Dad kept his .38. "Did you see?" "I saw it." His voice was flat, controlled, but I caught the slight tremor underneath. Dad had been a Marine before I was born, had seen action in places he wouldn't talk about, and I'd never heard that particular note in his voice before. Fear, maybe, or recognition. The truck lurched as something scraped along the passenger side, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified through metal and fiberglass. The scraping followed us for maybe 10 feet, keeping pace with our speed, before trailing off into silence. Dad's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. "What the fuck was that?" The profanity slipped out before I could stop it, but Dad didn't even blink. His attention was fixed on the road ahead, where our headlights illuminated the fresh snow like a blank page waiting to be written on. And something had been writing on it. The track started about 50 yards from where we'd heard the scraping. At first, I thought they might be from a large dog or maybe a wolf. We'd had reports of wolves returning to the area in recent years. But as we drove alongside them, the wrongness became apparent. The tracks were too widely spaced, for one thing. Whatever made them had a stride longer than any 4-legged animal I knew. And the impressions themselves were all wrong, not paw prints, but something that looked almost like elongated handprints, each one sunk deep into the snow with what looked like claw marks extending from the fingertips. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Those tracks. I see them. He was slowing the truck now, and I realized we were approaching the turnoff to the cabin. The tracks continued straight up the mountain road, paralleling our route. Get the gun. I fumbled with the glove compartment, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. The .38 felt heavier than usual, and when I checked the cylinder, my heart nearly stopped. Empty. Every chamber was empty. Dad, the gun. There's no bullets. For the first time since we'd started this drive, he looked at me directly. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and that scar on his arm seemed to be pulsing in the dashboard light. Check the box. There was a small ammunition box wedged behind the registration papers. I grabbed it with trembling fingers, but when I tried to open it, nothing happened. The safety latch was stuck, or maybe my hands were just too unsteady to work it properly. I could hear something moving outside the truck now. Not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic sound like something large dragging itself through the snow. The cabin came into view, its dark windows reflecting our headlights like dead eyes. The tracks we'd been following curved away from the road here, disappearing into the tree line, but I could see where they emerged again on the other side of the clearing. Whatever was making them had circled the cabin multiple times from the look of it, creating a complex pattern in the snow that hurt to look at directly. Dad didn't even slow down at the turnoff. He kept the truck pointed straight ahead, down the mountain, away from the cabin and whatever was pacing us through the trees. I could see movement in my peripheral vision, something keeping pace with us just beyond the reach of our headlights, flowing between the trees with that same unnatural grace we'd witnessed on the road. We're not stopping? I asked, though part of me was relieved. No. His voice was barely audible over the engine noise. We're not stopping. The thing in the trees stayed with us for another mile, maybe two. I caught glimpses of it whenever we rounded a curve, a dark shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving with a purpose that made my skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of snow against the windshield. We didn't speak again until we reached the paved county road. Dad pulled over at the first gas station we found, a lonely Texaco with flickering fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and unreal. He sat there for a long moment, engine running, staring at his hands on the steering wheel. That scar was still visible, still pulsing with his heartbeat. That wasn't an animal, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of something he'd been carrying for years. I've seen it before. I wanted to ask him wanted to know what had really happened to his arm all those years ago, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I watched as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for our insurance agent. Yeah, it's Tom Morrison, he said when the call connected. I need to file a claim on the cabin property. Total loss. Fire damage. He paused, listening. No, I'm not there now. Won't be going back. When he hung up, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a small brass key, the spare key to the cabin that he'd carried for as long as I could remember. Without a word, he rolled down his window and threw it out into the snow-covered parking lot, where it disappeared with a small, final sound. We drove home in silence, and we never went back to the mountain. 3 months later, Dad sold the property to a development company sight unseen. I should have taken the interstate. That thought kept circling my head as I squinted through the windshield at another unmarked intersection, my headlights carving a weak cone through the October darkness. The GPS had died 20 miles back when the last cell tower disappeared behind a ridge of pine trees, leaving me with nothing but instinct and a quarter tank of gas to navigate these forgotten back roads. The fuel gauge needle hovered, just above the red line, mocking me. I'd been driving for 3 hours since leaving the conference in Burlington, confident I could find a shortcut home through Vermont's rural maze. Now the digital clock read 11:47 p.m., and I hadn't seen another car, or any sign of civilization, for the better part of an hour. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I approached what looked like a wider spot in the road. Maybe I could pull over, get my bearings, figure out which direction might lead back to something resembling a main road. The SUV's engine had been making a subtle whining sound for the last few miles, and I didn't want to push my luck any further into this wilderness. I eased off the accelerator and guided the vehicle onto what passed for a shoulder, really just a strip of gravel and dead grass between the asphalt and the tree line. The moment I shifted into park and killed the engine, an absolute silence descended that made my ears ring. No traffic, no wind, no distant hum of civilization. Just the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine and my own shallow breathing. I fumbled for my phone, knowing it was useless but checking anyway. No signal as expected. The screen's blue glow felt alien in the darkness pressing against the windows. I'd have to make a choice soon. Continue burning gas on these maze-like roads, or try to conserve fuel and wait for dawn. Neither option appealed to me. That's when I heard it. Click. Click, click. Click. The sound came from somewhere outside, rhythmic but irregular, like someone tapping a pen against their teeth while thinking. I held my breath and listened. The clicking seemed to move, circling the SUV in a slow, deliberate pattern. My heart began hammering against my ribs. Click, click. Click. Click, click, click. It was definitely moving. Starting from the front of the vehicle, the sound traveled along the passenger side, each click distinct and sharp against the night air. I reached for the door locks, grateful to hear the solid thunk as they engaged. My breathing had gone shallow and quick. The clicking continued its circuit around the back of the SUV. I twisted in my seat, trying to peer through the rear window, but the darkness beyond my taillights was impenetrable. Whatever was making that sound stayed just outside the reach of my lights, as if it knew exactly where the illumination ended. Click. Click, click. Click. Now it was on the driver's side, and I could swear the sound was getting closer to the vehicle itself. Not just circling at a distance, but moving in. My hand hovered over the ignition key, every instinct screaming at me to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But something kept me frozen in place, a terrible curiosity, or maybe just the paralysis of pure fear. The clicking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I waited, counting heartbeats, straining to detect any sound that might tell me where the thing had gone. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but wrong somehow. The rhythm was off, like someone walking on joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. The sound approached from the front of the vehicle, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was out there was about to step into my headlight beams. I should have started the engine. Should have thrown it in reverse and floored it the moment I heard the first click. Instead, I sat transfixed as a shadow began to resolve at the edge of my lights. First, I saw the feet, or what I assumed were feet. They were pale and elongated, with too many joints, bending and flexing as they found purchase on the asphalt. Then legs that seemed to go on forever, thin and wrong-angled, like a spider's limbs scaled up to human size. The thing stepped fully into the light, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs a grotesque parody of human anatomy. Arms that hung too long, ending in fingers that had too many knuckles. A torso that seemed stretched, as if someone had grabbed a person by the head and feet and pulled. And the head was the worst part. It sat atop that impossible neck at an angle that should have been fatal, tilted just enough to suggest that whatever this thing was, it had never been truly human. The face was a blur in the headlight glare, features that seemed to shift and refused to hold still long enough for my brain to catalog them. It stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, swaying slightly as if testing its balance. Then it opened what I assumed was its mouth. Run. The word hit me like a physical blow. Not because of what it said, but because of how it said it. The voice was mine. My exact voice, down to the slight rasp I'd developed from too many years of smoking in college. The inflection, the tone, even the way I unconsciously dropped the N sound at the end. It was perfect. Impossibly, terrifyingly perfect. My hand found the ignition key and twisted it with desperate strength. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the transmission into reverse without looking behind me. The SUV lurched backward, tires spinning on loose gravel, and I cranked the wheel hard to the right. Through the windshield, I caught one last glimpse of the thing. It hadn't moved, just stood there in my headlight beams with that impossible posture, watching me flee. Then I completed the 3-point turn and floored the accelerator, racing back down the road I'd come from. I didn't slow down for the next 20 miles, taking curves at speeds that should have sent me into the trees, my hands locked on the steering wheel and my foot pressed to the floor. Every shadow between the trees looked like reaching limbs. Every reflection in my mirrors might have been pale, wrong-jointed legs keeping pace with my vehicle. It wasn't until I saw the blessed neon glow of a diner sign that I finally eased off the gas. The Moonrise Diner sat like a beacon of normalcy beside the road, its windows golden with warm light, a few pickup trucks scattered in the gravel parking lot. I pulled in and sat in my SUV for a full minute, hands shaking, before I trusted my legs to carry me inside. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and a heavy-set cook looked up from the grill behind the counter. He had kind eyes and grease-stained apron, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a pot. "Please." My voice came out as a croak. As he poured, I noticed him glance toward the windows, then back at me with a slight frown. "Funny thing," he said conversationally. "Heard a car pull up about 10 minutes ago, but nobody came in. Then you show up, and I can see all that fresh gravel dust on your vehicle. But you're the first customer I've had since 9 o'clock. I followed his gaze to the parking lot, counting the vehicles I could see. 3 pickups, all with a thin layer of road dust that spoke of longer residence. My SUV sat apart from them, and even in the diner's light, I could see the cloud of dust still settling around its tires. "Must have been someone else," I managed, wrapping my hands around the coffee mug for warmth. The cook shrugged and went back to his grill, but I caught him glancing out the window a few more times. I sat there until dawn, drinking coffee and trying to convince myself that exhaustion and stress had created the whole experience. It almost worked. It wasn't until I was loading my bags back into the SUV the next morning that I noticed them. 2 parallel gouges in the sidewall of my front passenger tire. They were fresh, cutting through the rubber in clean lines, as if something with very sharp claws had tested the strength of the tire wall. I got in my SUV and drove home, but I kept the windows up and the doors locked. And later, when I was reviewing the voice memos on my phone, notes I'd been recording throughout the conference, I found something that made my blood freeze. There, in a file timestamped at 11:52 p.m., was a single word in my own voice. Run. I don't remember hitting record. The creek was supposed to be our escape, 3 days of nothing but water sounds and Sarah's laugh echoing off the canyon walls. We'd been planning this trip for months, marking the remote spot on our map where Willow Creek carved through granite cliffs, miles from any road that showed up on GPS. The hike took us 4 hours, our packs heavy with gear we'd probably never use. Sarah kept stopping to photograph wildflowers, her camera clicking against the silence. "Look at this place," she said, spreading her arms wide as we crested the final ridge. Below us, the creek twisted through a narrow valley, cottonwoods marking its path like green brushstrokes. We weren't alone. A white pickup truck sat parked in the small clearing where we'd planned to camp, its bed empty except for a faded bumper sticker I couldn't quite read from our vantage point. 2 men stood near the water's edge, their voices carrying up to us in fragments. "Maybe we should find another spot," Sarah said, lowering her camera. I shook my head. "It's a big creek. Plenty of room for everyone." As we descended, I got a better look at our neighbors. The older one wore a baseball cap, so whether the logo had worn away to ghost letters, the kind of hat that takes decades to achieve that particular shade of sun-bleached nothing. His companion looked younger, maybe 40, with the soft build of someone who spent more time indoors than out. "Afternoon," I called as we approached. The older man, Frank, he introduced himself, tipped his ancient cap. "Beautiful day for it. Fishing been good?" Sarah asked, setting down her pack. Frank and his friend exchanged a glance. "Oh, you know how it is," Frank said. "Some days they bite, some days they don't." I looked around their campsite. No rods leaning against trees. No tackle box. No cooler for keeping fish. Just a brand new dome tent still creased from its packaging and 2 folding chairs positioned to face the water. "What are you using for bait?" I pressed. "Worms," the younger man said quickly. "Flies," Frank said at the same time. Another glance between them. Frank cleared his throat. "Depends on the conditions, you know." We set up our tent 50 yards downstream, close enough to be neighborly but far enough to maintain the illusion of wilderness solitude. Sarah kept glancing back toward their camp as we worked. "Something feels off," she whispered as I hammered in the last stake. "They're just not very good fishermen," I said, but I'd noticed it too. The way they watched us more than the water, the way their conversation stopped whenever we moved around our campsite. The afternoon passed quietly. We filtered water, cooked dinner over our camp stove, played cards as the sun dropped behind the canyon rim. Frank and his friend remained in their chairs, occasionally standing to stretch or add wood to a fire that produced more smoke than heat. I pulled out my phone to check the time, no signal as expected. Sarah did the same, holding her device up toward the sky in the universal gesture of the disconnected. "Nothing. I'm going to try from up on that ridge," she said, pointing to a rocky outcrop above our camp. "Don't bother. We're in a dead zone here. That's part of the appeal, remember?" She nodded, but I caught her checking her phone twice more before we turned in for the night. I woke to Sarah's hand on my shoulder, her grip tight enough to leave marks. "Someone's outside," she whispered. I lay still listening. The creek's constant murmur made it hard to distinguish other sounds, but then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, moving slowly around our tent. Through the mesh window, I could see them. Frank and his friend stood motionless about 20 feet away, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. They weren't moving, weren't talking. Just standing there, watching. My heart hammered against my ribs. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. "What do they want?" Sarah breathed. I had no idea. The smart thing would be to stay quiet, wait them out. Maybe they were sleepwalking. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation for two grown men standing vigil over strangers' tents in the middle of the night. But every instinct I had was screaming danger. The minutes crawled by. 5, 10, 15. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like sentries, their faces lost in shadow. "We're leaving," Sarah said suddenly, her voice steady and decisive. "Right now. It's the middle of the night. The trail. I don't care." She was already moving, stuffing her sleeping bag into its sack with practiced efficiency. "We're not staying here with them." She was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't safe. We packed in whispered urgency, every sound amplified in the thin air. The watchers never moved. When we finally unzipped the tent fly, they were gone, vanished as silently as they'd appeared. The hike out was a nightmare of stumbling over rocks and catching branches in the dark. Sarah led the way, her headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the blackness. We didn't speak until we reached the truck, didn't feel safe until we were miles down the mountain road. "Jesus," I said, finally allowing myself to breathe. "What the hell was that about?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, but I'm glad we left." We drove straight to the sheriff's office in town, arriving just as the morning shift was starting. The deputy who took our report was polite but skeptical until I mentioned the white pickup truck. His expression changed. "You said it was parked at Willow Creek." "Yeah. Why?" He pulled up something on his computer, frowning at the screen. "We've been looking for that truck. Belongs to a 70-year-old man named Frank Morrison. He's been missing for 3 days." The blood drained from my face. "Missing?" His family reported him overdue from a fishing trip. "We found his truck. It was there yesterday, with 2 men. The deputy's frown deepened. "2 men? Can you describe them?" I told him about Frank, the weathered cap, the age that now made terrible sense. The younger man who'd seemed so out of place in the wilderness. "We'll send a team up there today," the deputy said. "But if what you're telling me is accurate..." He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. They never made any arrests. The official report listed Frank Morrison's death as accidental, a fall from the rocky outcrop where Sarah had tried to get cell service. The younger man was never identified, never found.